Hello everyone, this is going to be a YouTube video explaining how to write your executive power essay that I assigned earlier this week. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the PowerPoint right away. So we talked about American conduct in the global war on terror in the Bush and Obama and even the Trump administration a little bit. I don't think Obama administration likes that characterization of a war on terror, and I think they definitely rejected it. But nonetheless, we definitely kind of were trying to explore the expansion of executive power within using conduct across administrations as a vehicle to conduct across administrations in the post 9/11 era as a vehicle to do that. We looked a lot at a lot of different things, but for the piece of evidence that I recommend you use in this prompt, I recommend that you either talk about the Bush administration's enhanced interrogation practices, or you talk about the Obama administration's expansion of the drone program and increase in the operational tempo of the drone program specifically. The reason why I want us to do that instead is because the Trump administration is kind of very erratic with respect to like, I don't know that we could put it in a coherent framework yet. That's probably not the word. But I think maybe an essay could be written about the Trump administration, but like after Trump leaves, and about executive power and Trump and the global war on terror. So I want us to focus on the Obama or the Bush administration. We also kind of picked on Trump already with reading the From article and trying to develop refutation with the From article. So the prompt itself is pretty simple, or not simple, it's pretty complicated, I should say. It says, in times of war, issues related to national security. We'll define that word in a bit, and I'll include a Brookings Institution link for that word in a bit. Presidents have claimed broad power in the interest of protecting American lives. Critics have derided, and we said that's a word for heavily criticized, presidential actions across the Bush, Obama, and Trump administration as either authoritarian or a liberal, or both. And then develop an argument about whether the criticism is valid in the case of an administration of your choosing. And then it tells you to use one of the following foundational documents: Federalist 70, Federalist 51, Brutus No. 1, and evidence from your knowledge of the U.S. conduct on war on terror to support your argument. I give you specific definitions of authoritarianism, and remember, authoritarianism means disabling accountability by means of disinformation, secrecy, or disabling voice. And then liberalism means or describes a practice that attacks the dignity and freedom of individuals. And we discussed how there can be some overlap between those types of practices, so nothing to worry about yet. The word national security is something that I want to explore a little bit more, I think in the next slide. So I asked you guys to respond to this thesis statement. Some further breakdown of this prompt that I should say. This prompt is very specific. So it says, develop an argument about whether the criticism is valid is the case in an administration of your choosing. So this prompt seems very restrictive, but in some ways it's actually not very restrictive, because you can choose an administration, and then you can choose to determine whether that criticism is valid or invalid, whether it's got teeth behind it or whether it doesn't. And one of the ways that you can approach this validity argument, and I think this was kind of me parsing the definition of validity into something that it probably isn't, but it's okay because I wrote this prompt. But you could also say, in this case, whether you think that the terms authoritarian and illiberal apply in the conduct, but whether criticizing the conduct itself is wrong. I'll explain what I mean by that in my essay. So what I mean, well, I'll just explain a little bit now, but what I mean, you could say, okay, well, this drone program is obviously horrible. It's obviously disgusting. However, I do think that there are a lot of things wrong with war. We're in a time of war, and maybe that criticism, or at least loud criticism of this practice, is probably wrong. Right? It's a more nuanced argument. It's definitely an argument that's harder to make. I think it's an easier argument to make to say that the action across these administrations, or in one specific administration, is authoritarian. And I'm letting you choose either the word authoritarian or a liberal to focus on. You can choose one or the other to focus on. So I'll choose one myself. Then I gave you writing structures that you can use if you really, really need help, but I think they suck. Like, I hate writing structures, so never use writing structures. Here is choose one of Mr. Diaz's sample thesis statements you like, what's good about it. Choose one that you don't like, what's bad about it. We did that as a pair deck because remember we kind of wrote this in class together over several days, and then I offered it to you to use. We also kind of entangled this word national security because it is in the prompt itself. And this is something that I just wanted to bring and raise awareness to. So oftentimes when we hear a lot of pundits on television or a lot of media personalities or even politicians talk about national security, they talk about it in terms that I would say some critics say are reductive. And so what I mean by this is that they talk about it in terms of usually military operations. They talk about it specifically within the context of conversations about the military or policing in the United States. And they talk about it usually in terms of the prospects of a major power conflict with another country, or the prospects of terrorism, a terrorist attack, usually. This was especially true before the pre-COVID era. But there was a lot of critics that said that this definition of national security, and this is from a person that is interested in national security law. It's one of the reasons I'm thinking of returning to Georgetown for Georgetown law, so I can become an even better teacher. I'm still up in the air whether I want to go to law school or not, but we'll see. But what does national security, or national security has this tendency in, or before COVID, it was very much applied in that context, in the context of like the prospects of major power war, or prospects of entering a war with another country. And certainly after the September 11th terrorist attacks, national security was often used within debates or conversations about global terrorism, international terrorism. I would say that this term is constantly shifting. It's a very amorphous term. It has the word national in it, so we know that we're talking about something across that's affecting the United States in some way, and security. Before the September 11th terrorist attacks, I would say that the idea of terrorism as an issue related to national security was not widely accepted in some circles. I think definitely in before the collapse of the Soviet Union, conversations of national security centered on the Soviet Union, on discussions of either the expansion or perceived expansion or contraction of communism. After the September 11th terrorist attacks, I have no doubt that national security has focused a lot on terrorist attacks, and specifically terrorist attacks from Salafi jihadi terrorists, or you can think of them like Al-Qaeda type terrorist groups. But there has been constant calls, or been calls for a redefinition of national security to include other concepts. And I included a link to a Brookings Institution event before the COVID pandemic about redefining the term national security. right? It's a very amorphous term that's often used in very different ways. And so redefining the term national security is super important. And this is the Brookings Institution event that I included in the description. There's some people saying that, well, there are other things that are parts and components to national security, such as the prospect of a pandemic, of an infectious disease pandemic, right? We had been confronted with infectious disease management challenges before, such as in the Ebola epidemic. There was a couple of cases in the United States and it was mitigated. There was all kinds of reporting and an acknowledgement in some intelligence agencies that a pandemic was a very real threat that could present unique challenges to a nation. No doubt the coronavirus pandemic has done lasting impact, negative impact on our economy, has claimed the lives of many hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and about 200,000 people currently in the United States, and unfortunately that number is set to go up. Has threatened our way of life. I'm teaching you guys through a screen in ways that the September 11th terrorist attacks never did. And so some people say that when we talk about national security, we should include stuff like that, right? And you could see that too, because you can actually see how people kind of struggle in a culture like in the United States, where national security and the military as an institution is revered as an institution that protects us against threats to national security. You could see this almost struggling to apply that language to the time, right, and the COVID pandemic, right? And you could see that in what I mean by this is that people had commonly understood national security in militaristic terms, or as being associated with the military. And so therefore we started seeing rhetoric such as first responders being, or like nurses and doctors being heroes, which undoubtedly they are, but even applying the label of essential workers to people that work at HEB. And then we started seeing like military flyovers over New York City to honor nurses and doctors, frontline workers in the coronavirus pandemic. And then we even started seeing, again, the president, when he took the coronavirus pandemic seriously, because he's gone back and forth on this issue, and this is not an opinion, you can see at least personally seriously. You can see that in his tweets. Tweets speak for themselves, to paraphrase Sean Spicer, and probably the president's other secretaries of press secretaries. But here is Donald Trump very much applying like the traditional language of national security to the moment in March, where he says the world is at war with a hidden enemy, we will win, right? Very militaristic language, right? And so it's kind of like shows that our thinking about national security is very much a militarized thinking, or it's militaristic, or it's predisposed to place and use militaristic language, and maybe that's inappropriate. So some philosophical questions to get us started. Some people have said we need to include other things in national security as well. Poverty in national security. We need to include climate change and discussions about national security. That certainly, as someone that studied international security at Georgetown, you should not go into an international security class at Georgetown University and expect to hear terrorism is the biggest national security threat we face. No, it's usually centers around like issues of climate change, or the threat of major power war or nuclear conflict, stuff like that, right? Terrorism is kind of seen as a peripheral threat that just scares a lot of people, but in reality, statistically, it's insignificant. At least that's what I got from a lot of the courses that I took at Georgetown. Yeah. But nonetheless, presidents have claimed extensive powers, extensive inherent powers, right? The president has formal powers under the Constitution, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. They've claimed extensive emergency powers in times of great national crisis and in times of war, and we see that specifically in the case of the rendition, detention, interrogation program of the Central Intelligence Agency, and we also see that specifically in the Obama administration's expansion of the operational tempo of drone strikes. It's this very much, we see these powers at play, I should say, and we see assertions of these powers specifically in the Bush administration. So I'll include links to several cool articles about legal theories. Remember we said that like the Constitution is very vague and there's all kinds of legal theories at play and trying to that probably serve political interests, and in the case of the Bush administration probably served to say that the Bush administration had more powers and had this expansive view of executive power and the Bush administration's ability to engage in enhanced interrogation techniques, or to be politically incorrect, torture. Also, this is one piece of evidence that you can use, Federalist 70. I will say Federalist 70 is very much can be used when presenting a counter argument, or Federalist 70 can very much be used when, in the context of an essay that thinks the criticism of either an Obama administration policy or a Bush administration policy, which I want you to focus on, is invalid or is probably too severe. All right, so Federalist 70 was very much Hamilton saying that a vigorous, strong executive is inconsistent with the genius of Republican government. The enlightened well-wishers to the species of government must at least hope that the supposition or assumption is destitute, lacking a foundation, since they can never admit its truth without at the same time admitting the condemnation of their own principles. Energy. Oh yeah, so it talks about energy in the executive is the leading character in the definition of a good government, right? They get stuff done, right? We don't want like a council of executives, because there was some debate whether there should be a council of executives or there should only be one person vested with the power of the executive. No, we need someone that's going to get stuff done. We don't need a feeble or weak executive. Implies a feeble or weak execution of law. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution. A government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. But then we also said you can use Brutus number 1, and I think Brutus number 1 is a great piece of evidence that you can use to definitely support a thesis statement that says that the criticism of whichever administration that you hold is valid. And then Federalist 51 is a document about separation of powers and checks and balances. So let's get into the actual writing. So I put some different resources here so that you're aware of like different programs that existed in the Bush administration. We talked about the CIA and Department of Defense enhanced interrogation programs at length. We talked about the Bybee memo specifically on the potential lawfulness of CIA and DoD enhanced interrogation programs. Here is the legal memo specifically. So you can open it here, open hyperlink. That the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice, so a Bush administration lawyer, gave to the president's lawyer, Alberto Gonzalez. And so you can read the whole memo, and it basically, in the memo, it's trying to justify the enhanced interrogation techniques that we talked about, use of waterboarding, all that kind of stuff, or it provides a legal foundation for that justification, I should say. And you can see here, at one point, I think is pretty memorable, the president's commander-in-chief power. And so it says pretty specifically, even if an interrogation method arguably were to violate section 2340A, and remember section 2340A is the law against torture. There's a statute or a federal law in the United States against torturing people. It says the statute would be unconstitutional. The law itself would be unconstitutional if it encroached upon the president's constitutional power to conduct a military campaign. As Commander-in-Chief, the President has the constitutional authority to order interrogations of enemy combatants to gain intelligence information concerning the military plans of the enemy. The demands of the Commander-in-Chief power are especially pronounced in the middle of a war in which the nation has already suffered a direct attack. In such a case, the information gained from interrogations may prevent future attacks by foreign enemies. Any effort to apply Section 2340A in a manner that interferes with the President's direction of such core war matters as the detention and interrogation of enemy combatants thus would be unconstitutional. And what I wanted you to know about this particular piece of information in particular, or this particular piece, is that hold on, I'm getting a message. Microsoft. What I wanted you to know about this particular memo is that it's basically saying it's asserting executive power, right? We discussed and we saw in the Constitution that the president is given certain expressed powers in the Constitution, and the presidents have claimed since then inherent powers, right? Powers that aren't expressed in the Constitution, but they've claimed them, like in times of national emergency and stuff like that. However, this is a very expansive claim of executive power that the Bush administration lawyers are putting forth. They're saying that a law that even in the whole memo, they themselves like claim that the enhanced interrogation techniques are not torture. They define torture in a certain way. We discussed that they define torture as something that leads to organ failure or death. And as long as you don't lead to that, then it's not torture, whatever. But then in this paragraph in particular, they're saying, but even if it were torture, that law against torture in the United States would be unconstitutional, would not be valid. It would be effectively void if it impeded on the president's constitutional power to conduct a military campaign. So they're basically saying the president as commander-in-chief has these broad powers. It's a time of national emergency, so the president has inherent powers. So the president has the authority to start these types of programs, or these programs are lawful. They are legal, right? And so on the potential lawfulness of the CIA and Department of Defense enhanced interrogation programs, you can see that Bybee presents a memo with a broad view of executive power, right? A huge view of executive power. And we said that this becomes a key point in the installation of programs in the CIA and the Department of Defense to install enhanced interrogation programs. Then we also included in the resource section here is a short clip you can watch here where you can actually see my ex-professor, Elizabeth Graham Arsenault, started at where it says, I think it's 11 minutes, specifically talk about getting our Interrogation Intelligence Gathering Public Policy Center for Security Studies at Georgetown, specifically talk to the one of the deputy directors of the Central Intelligence Agency that oversaw the enhanced interrogation program at the CIA, oversaw the rendition program, the practice of rendering or taking people and suspected terrorists to different countries where there was more lax treatment or humanitarian laws, so more lax conditions for treatment. So you can see that here to also use as a resource to describe as a piece of evidence, right? And then right here too, there's a short video clip of Harold Koh, who was a Obama administration lawyer in the State Department, discussing the legality of the drone program in the Obama administration. Remember, we talked about how the drone program, we watched that little short clip from John Oliver, has certain, that President Obama dramatically expanded the operational tempo of the drone program, the frequency of drone use, how drone strikes are often this very secretive process that a lot of us, it's very secretive process. There's all kinds of lack of knowledge about the exact number of civilians and combatants killed in the drone program. Yeah, And so this discusses the legality of the drone program. So the drone program it seems it's not as big of a leap or a big of a claim in executive power that Coe makes here. It seems pretty lawful if you consider the United States in a time of war. It seems well within the purview of the president's authority to order drone strikes against suspected terrorists. It's not as big of an assertion of executive power as this Bybee memo certainly is. However, we may still have qualms about it, right? And this essay is fundamentally about your perspective on executive power, right? Your perspective on assertions of executive power too, and specifically in the case of the Bybee memo. Do you think it's appropriate? Even if it is legal, it still can unsettle you, right? It still can conflict with your idea of what is right, right? It still can make you think of it as authoritarian or liberal. So I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm actually going to write the essay in the other piece, but this will be like the backstory and resources video, like explanation of resources video, and then I'll write the essay or essays in the other video.